The president's nominee to lead the Defense Department, former Senator Chuck Hagel, is under intense scrutiny as he and the White House try to push back against critics of his foreign policy views. To that end, this morning, someone who strongly supports the Hagel nomination, the former Secretary of State, General Colin Powell, who is here to speak out exclusively to us. General Powell, good morning. Welcome back to the program.
Good morning, David. Good to be here.
Lots of topics to get to with you, but I want to start on Chuck Hagel. Why do you think he should be confirmed?
I think there are a number of reasons. First, I think he's had a very, very distinguished public service record that he can stand on. There are a lot of comments about different things he's said over the years, and I think he'll have a chance to respond to all those comments at his confirmation hearings. But it might be useful just to stand back and take a look at this man overall. A young man who volunteered to go to Vietnam. They wanted to send him to Europe, a nice, safe place. He said, no, I want to go to Vietnam. He and his brother went. They both were wounded. He was wounded twice. He came back from Vietnam. He went to school under the GI Bill and Veterans Administration. From there, he went to other things in life. He supported President Reagan in his run for office, and as a result of that, he received an appointment as Deputy Director of the Veterans Administration. To show you the kind of courage this guy has and what he believes in, he quit after 1 year because he felt the Veterans Administration was not doing a good job for veterans, and he couldn't take that. He went back to private life, started a cellular company. In those days, it was something rather remarkable and new. Made a fortune, did very, very well, and he continued to serve. And while he was running that cellular company, he also was president of the USO, which was in trouble. So this is a guy who knows veterans, knows the troops, knows the USO. And when people say, well, that doesn't necessarily make him a good candidate for Secretary of Defense, I'll tell you who thinks that makes him a good candidate for Secretary of Defense: the men and women in the armed forces of the United States and their parents, who know that this is a guy who will be very careful about putting their lives at risk, because he put his life at risk. He knows what war is, and he will fight a war if it's necessary. But he's a guy who will do it with great deliberation and care. Beyond that, then, he went back to Nebraska, ran for Senate, became a senator, said he would only serve two terms, and when he was elected the second time, he was elected with 83% of the vote. This is a guy respected by his fellow citizens in Nebraska. Served here for a total of 12 years, and what did he do when he left the Senate? He became an academic in Georgetown School of Foreign Service, teaching the new leaders. He also has been co-chairman of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. He's also on the Defense Policy Board. This is a gentleman who knows all of these issues in depth. He is a fellow who speaks his mind. He sometimes gets in trouble with those who think he should not speak his mind, but he says what he believes and he sticks with it. So the issues that are being raised now are important issues, and that's why we have a confirmation hearing. And I'm sure that Chuck will be able to deal with those issues at the hearing.
Well, let's go through a few of them. Okay. On Iran, he's been criticized for his views. He failed to label Iran's Revolutionary Guard a terror organization. He's advocated direct talks with Iran, which have not borne fruit. He even advocated taking force off of the table when dealing with Iran. Steve Hayes in the Weekly Standard wrote in his blog this week something which I'll put up on the screen. Hagel's views on Iran put him to Obama's left, he writes, although the president has made clear that he doesn't want war with Iran and he is an open direct talks, has been open to direct talks. He's never ruled out the military option as his defense nominee has. Given some of those constraints, how would he advise this president on how to overcome the threat from Iran?
Well, first of all, I don't think that's necessarily a current and accurate assessment. I think what Chuck Hagel has said is that nothing is ever off the table. But he is one who believes in the prospects for negotiation. We have been ready to negotiate under the right set of circumstances with Iran for the last several years with our friends and allies. And so force is on the table. But I'm glad that we have people like the president and like Chuck Hagel who will be very careful when you start throwing around the terms.
He says it's not feasible, though. Do you agree it's not feasible?
What is not feasible?
Military option? A military
option is always feasible if you tell me what the option is. Are we going to blow up Tehran, or are we going to go after some facilities that might be very well protected and hidden? And I think it was Bob Gates, the previous Secretary of Defense, who pointed out that the difficulty of striking these places is a real one. And so any military option is feasible in terms of dropping bombs. But what is the result of that military attack? With respect to the Revolutionary Guard, he has reasons for why he didn't go along with that resolution at the time, and that will be explored in the confirmation hearings. For the last 3 weeks, we've had dueling op-eds and dueling blogs and dueling different groups coming forward. But most of the national security community in retirement that I know, and many of the secretaries of defense and state that I know, and national security advisors, and very distinguished ambassadors who served in the Middle East to think that Chuck Hagel is a solid guy who speaks his mind. He's a good supporter of Israel. He has been there, and the record will show that. But he is not reluctant to disagree when he thinks disagreement is appropriate.
You brought up Israel. He referred to a Jewish lobby, saying it intimidates a lot of people on Capitol Hill. What kind of thinking does that reflect? Can you understand pro-Israel senators being concerned by that comment?
They shouldn't be that concerned. That term slips out from time to time. There was an article this week that the Israeli newspaper Haaretz has occasionally used the same thing. And so Chuck should have said Israeli lobby, not Jewish lobby, and perhaps he needs to write on a blackboard 100 times, it is the Israeli lobby. But there is an Israeli lobby. There are people who are very supportive of the state of Israel. I'm very supportive of the state of Israel. So is Senator Hagel, and you'll see that in the confirmation hearings. But it doesn't mean you have to agree with every single position that the Israeli government takes.
Fair enough, but on a couple of measures that seemed very important. He seemed to feel so strongly about his views about Israel that he was a distinct minority in the Senate. For instance, one of only 4 senators in October of 2000 who would not sign a letter expressing solidarity with Israel as there was an intifada that was going on. Only one of 2 senators in July of 21 to vote against renewing the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. When he came back from a trip in 1998, he was critical of Israel, and the Associated Press reported it this way. The headline, "Senator blames Israel for the peace impasse." Hagel said the U.S. must do what it can to re-energize the Mideast peace process. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has, and this is quoting Hagel, essentially stopped the process. The Israeli government essentially continues to play games, stonewalling implementation of the Oslo peace accords. What I fear more today is that desperate men do desperate things when you take hope away, Hagel said, and that's where the Palestinians are today. There's a sense among his critics that he views this in an even-handed way, that they equally share the blame, Israelis and Palestinians, for their failure to achieve peace. Is that his view?
Well, I'll let you know, he should be able to give his views, which he will do at the confirmation hearing. I don't believe that there is moral equivalency between the two sides, which is the suggestion of that article.
You believe he believes there's moral equivalency?
You'll have to ask him what he believes. My judgment and my knowledge of Chuck and my discussions with Chuck would suggest that he wants to see both sides come to the table and find a solution. He supports the peace process. But he is uppermost a very, very strong supporter of the state of Israel. He's voted for billions and billions of dollars of aid to Israel. So I have no question that when it comes to challenges that have anything to do with putting Israel at risk, Chuck Hagel will be on Israel's side. And remember, he's working for a president, and he will follow the policies of that president.
The renewed debate about Iraq is also occurring. The New York Times writes about that today. And in his memoir, he writes something very pointed about the Iraq War. He writes, "It all comes down to the fact that we were asked to vote on a resolution based on half-truths, untruths, and wishful thinking. I voted for this resolution that gave the president the authority to go to war in Iraq. If all diplomatic efforts were exhausted and failed, unfortunately, it was not his intention to exhaust all diplomatic efforts." He's talking about the diplomatic efforts you were engaged in as Secretary of State in the run-up to the war in Iraq.
I would disagree with his characterization. We were basing all of our actions on a national intelligence estimate that the Congress asked for, that was provided to the Congress by the CIA. And all of us in the Bush administration at that time accepted the judgment of our 16 intelligence communities. I presented it to the UN. 3 months before I presented to the UN, Congress passed a resolution, also supported by Senator Hagel and many other senators, that would give the president the authority to go to war. Weren't half-truths, is what we were being told by the intelligence community. We subsequently found out that a lot of that information was not accurate. And that is very unfortunate, but that's the way it unfolded.
Was he wrong on Iraq?
With respect to what?
With respect to what he ultimately called a huge foreign policy blunder?
That's his characterization, and if people want to challenge his characterization, they'll have that opportunity.
But in your judgment, was he wrong on Iraq?
I would not have called it that. I would have said that what I think was wrong was the president had more than sufficient basis to believe that there were weapons of mass destruction that were a danger to the world, and with the possibility of those weapons going to terrorists. And so he undertook military action. I think that was the correct thing to do, and it was well supported by the intelligence. I think we did not execute the operation well. Once Baghdad fell, there was a feeling that, well, that was the end of it. That was not the end of it. That was just the beginning of it.
Beyond his foreign policy views, he's also been controversial for some comments he made about gays. He said of an ambassadorial nominee during the Clinton administration that he was, quote, aggressively gay and that would detract from his effectiveness. He has apologized for those comments.
And the apology has been accepted by the ambassador.
By Ambassador Hormel. But the question that has been raised is, can he, as defense secretary, forcefully implement the reversal of don't ask, don't tell at a critical time, especially when they have not resolved same-sex partner benefits, for instance?
Don't ask, don't tell isn't there anymore. It doesn't have to be reversed. It's gone. And I think that what Senator Hagel will do is he has said, and as he will certainly testify at the confirmation hearing, that he will fully implement don't ask, don't tell. There are still issues that have to be resolved, but I think he will go after these issues in a way that will be very consistent with the administration's position, with the law, and with the aspirations of our gay and lesbian men and women in the military. You know, he is now responsible for them. He is now responsible for them having a proper environment in which to do their jobs, and that will include making sure that don't ask, don't tell, and the elimination of don't ask, don't tell is fully implemented.
With regard to the military budget, he has called the military a bloated organization. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, said this week that we're on the brink of creating a hollow force. Would a Secretary of Defense, Hagel, preside over the hollowing out of the Defense Department?
The biggest concern with respect to hollowing out is this sequester that's hanging like a sword over the department. That's what they have tried. They have to not let that happen. But with respect to going in and finding things within the Department of Defense that perhaps you don't need or you can eliminate, if that's what you mean by bloat, I hope he does find bloat and gets rid of it.
Do you agree with his characterization that it's bloated?
Well, bloated doesn't necessarily mean the whole department is bloated. Bloated means there are probably things in the department that you can take a hard look at and determine whether or not you need it in light of the current situation and the strategy that we are implementing. You know, when I was chairman, we saw the end of the Soviet Union, a completely different change in our strategic positioning, and we eliminated 1 million troops and cut the budget 25%. That's not the case now, but there's no reason why a Secretary of Defense should go into office thinking can't change anything, can't cut anything. You know, the people who say that, oh, that's terrible, he's going to try to find things to cut in the department, are the same people who are saying, we've got to cut spending, we've got to cut spending. Everything has to be looked at. Entitlements, more revenue, and yes, you have to look at the Defense Department to see if there are opportunities for savings.
Bottom line, does Chuck Hagel get confirmed?
I think he gets confirmed. I think he's superbly qualified based on his overall record, based on his service to the country, based on how he feels about troops and veterans and families. I think he will do a great job as Secretary of Defense. And I think in his confirmation hearings, all of these issues that you've raised, that others have raised, he'll be prepared to deal with. I've read some of the responses that he's already put together, and I think he will make a very, very spirited defense of his position, and I think he'll be confirmed.
More broadly, talking about the national security team, it's interesting the president chose this political fight over Chuck Hagel. He declined to have it over Susan Rice. What was your view of her treatment in this whole process?
I think it was not handled well. One of the problems, both with Ambassador Rice and with Chuck Hagel, these sort of signals come out that this is who we are thinking about. And you're left out there to dangle for weeks. Well, if this is who you're going to nominate him. And let's get on with the process. So
you feel like the president let her hang out to dry?
In both the Susan Rice case and in the Chuck Hagel case, if they were sure that's who they were going to nominate, I think it should have been done promptly. But all of these sort of test nominations that they send out there, I think just cause the media to naturally focus on it, and potential opponents to that nomination just pile on.
Outgoing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, she's facing pressure to testify on the Benghazi matter. Do you think the Benghazi episode is a blot on her record as Secretary of State? Do you think it will affect her political future?
No, I don't think so. I don't know what she knew about it or didn't know about it or where she was, and so we'll have to wait and see how the testimony goes. But I think she's had a distinguished record, and I don't think that this one incident, which is one of these things that those of us in government have been through many, many times, where suddenly an action happens late at night. You're surprised. Somebody gets killed. Something gets blown up. And then the after-action reports start, and everybody wants to know who was at fault, who was responsible, why didn't we keep this from happening? Well, you can't keep everything from happening. Benghazi was a very, very difficult one in a difficult situation, and maybe they shouldn't have been there in the first place. And I think that we have had a good review of that by Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen, and I don't know whether the Congress in their examination of Mrs. Clinton will find something that they find distasteful. But I don't think it's a blot on her record.
Do you think Hillary Clinton would make a good president?
I think she'd be good at whatever she does. Whether she is interested in it or not, I will let her opine on that.
The broader issue of the foreign policy team, as I was just reflecting on, is the message that it appears to send. The Financial Times summed it up this way with the headline this week: Hagel's selection seals end to Bush's policies. This does not look like a let's invade Iran team, said Bruce Riedel, a longtime CIA officer who has also advised presidents on counterterrorism. It looks to me like a fine and alternative to military action team, preferably a diplomatic solution. Beyond Iran, it seems like this is a real rebuke to neoconservatives, those in the Republican Party who may feel there's unfinished business in the Middle East and want to continue to project American power. Do you view it that way?
Well, you know, the first Obama administration was also not an administration saying, let's go find some place to bomb. Neither, for that matter, was President Bush's 8 years. We fought the wars that we felt were necessary, but President Bush worked hard to try to solve other problems through diplomatic means. And so I think it's a little too stark to make this kind of characterization. I, as you well know, always believe that we should try to avoid war. We should be willing to talk to friends and willing to talk to enemies and try to find a solution that's peaceful. But when you do find it is necessary to use military force, use it with a clear political objective in mind and use it for a decisive result. That's the kind of attitude that Chuck Hagel will bring to the equation. He will be careful. He will give the president his best advice on the use or non-use of military force, how to solve the problem diplomatically. I'm sure he'll be a great companion with Mr. Kerry in that regard. It's a good team. I think it's a very, very good team. Now, a lot of my friends in the community who are of a more rightist persuasion, the ones who've been the Hawks.
Well, the Hawks. Do you think they're out of line in their criticism here?
No, they're fair criticisms. They can make all the criticisms they want. When they go over the edge and say, because Chuck said Jewish lobby, he's anti-Semitic, that's disgraceful. We shouldn't have that kind of language in our dialogue. But they're fully entitled to their views, and I didn't ever think they would go away and not be heard from again. But they have to remember one thing. It's President Obama, not President McCain, and not President Romney. They've lost 2 elections. The American people have made it clear that they are not particularly interested in finding new conflicts to get into. And they're not particularly interested in saying, sanctions are just a road bump on the way to bombing. We should be very, very careful when we sort of toss around theories of the use of military for situations that might be resolved in other ways. And the other thing I like to say about Iran is we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. We are punishing them severely now with the sanctions. We ought to keep it up, multilateral sanctions, whatever unilateral things we want to do. And let's also remember, this is a country that's in deep trouble. Does not have a nuclear weapon yet. We don't want it to have one. But remember what we have. I still am an old-fashioned realist that says deterrence still works. And they should know what the consequences to them would be if they ever were to use or cause us to believe they were going to use such a weapon if they had it, and they don't have it yet.
To mix some foreign policy with some politics, I'm struck when you talk about Republicans as they. I know you insist, despite voting for President Obama twice now, that you're still a Republican. But as I go through your record on some social issues and even foreign policy issues, I challenge you a little bit to say, on what basis are you still a Republican? Do you feel like this Republican Party has left you, or have you left it?
I think the Republican Party right now is having an identity problem. And I'm still a Republican. I'm a Republican who grew up along with George Bush, 41. I grew up with Ronald Reagan, Cap Weinberger, Frank Carlucci, that Republican Party, the Republican Party of Dick Lugar and John Tower. But in recent years, there's been a significant shift to the right, and we have seen what that shift has produced to losing presidential campaigns. I think what the Republican Party needs to do now is take a very hard look at itself and understand that the country has changed. The country is changing demographically. And if the Republican Party does not change along with that demographic, they're going to be in trouble. And so when we see that in one more generation, the minorities of America African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans will be the majority of the country. You can't go around saying we don't want to have a solid immigration policy. We're going to dismiss the 47%. We are going to make it hard for these minorities to vote, as they did in the last election. What did that produce? The court struck most of that down. Most importantly, it caused people to turn out and stand in line because these Republicans are trying to keep us from voting. There's also a dark vein of intolerance in some parts of the party. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is they still sort of look down on minorities. How can I evidence that? When I see a former governor say that the president is shucking and jiving, that's a racial era slave term. When I see another former governor after the president's first debate where he didn't do very well, says that the president was lazy. He didn't say he was slow, he was tired, he didn't do well. He said he was lazy. Now, it may not mean anything to most Americans, but to those of us who are African Americans, the second word is shiftless, and then there's a third word that goes along with it. Birther, the whole birther movement. Why do senior Republican leaders tolerate this kind of discussion within the party? I think the party has to take a look at itself. It has to take a look at its responsibilities for health care. It has to take a look at immigration. It has to take a look at those less fortunate than us. The party has gathered unto itself a reputation that it is the party of the rich. It is the party of lower taxes. But there are a lot of people who are lower down the food chain, the economic chain, who are also paying lots of taxes relative to their income. And they need help. We need more education work being done in this country. We need a solid immigration policy. We have to look at climate change. There are a lot of things that the American people are expecting. And the Republican Party, as they get ready for the next election, really has to focus on some of these issues and not ignore them. Everybody wants to talk about who's going to be the candidate. You better think first about what's the party you're actually going to represent. If it's just going to represent the far right wing of the political spectrum, I think the party is in difficulty. I'm a moderate. I'm still a Republican. That's how I was raised. And until I voted for Mr. Obama twice, I had voted for 7 straight Republican presidents.
A couple of other foreign policy matters. What should the U.S. force in Afghanistan look like after next year?
I think the president's on track here. We've done by 2014, the end of 2014, as much as we can with our troops fighting on the ground. So we've raised up a large Afghan army and an Afghan national police force. Let's continue to give them assistance. Let's continue to advise them. Let's keep our counterterrorism people in place because it's al-Qaeda that we're really after. Remember, the Taliban wasn't even on our list of enemies in the first few days after 9/11. It's only when they refused to give up al-Qaeda. And so it's going to be up to the Afghan people and the Afghan forces in order to deal with any resurgent Taliban coming in. We can help them with intelligence. We can help them with weapons training, whatever they need. But the burden of defending their country and keeping it from falling again to the Taliban will rest squarely on the shoulders of the Afghans.
What about a zero option? Do you leave any troops there?
I've heard this rumor about a zero option. I don't know if there's any merit to it. You have to stay there. We have to have advisors. We have to watch where the money's going. We have to be able to conduct counterterrorism activities. So I wouldn't support a zero option. But there's always a tendency in Washington on these issues to say 2,000, 4,000, 10,000. That's not the right way to go about it. As a military planner, you determine what it is that we have to do. How many advisors do we need? What kind of military assistance group do we need? And then you determine what those numbers are. I don't know what those numbers are. The president has laid out some areas where we want to continue helping Afghanistan after 2014. And now the military will have to put numbers to those missions.
As you know, there's a renewed debate with the film Zero Dark 30 about interrogation techniques of terror prisoners. And this film, of course, based on the successful hunt for bin Laden. And the debate sort of harkens back to me to an appearance that former Vice President Cheney made on this program. He told Tim Russert at the time about some of the things that would become necessary. Let me show that.
We also have to work the dark side, if you will. We've got to spend time in the shadows and in the intelligence world. That's the world these folks operate in. And so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective. It is a mean, nasty, dangerous, dirty business out there, and we have to operate in that arena.
To the extent that enhanced interrogation techniques played some role in tracking down the major lead, the courier, which led to bin Laden, and I choose my words carefully. Do the ends justify the means?
We have determined that enhanced interrogation techniques such as waterboarding are torture. We're not going to do it anymore. The military didn't do it in the first place. And since 2003, it hasn't been done at all. I really can't answer the question as to whether or not the movie's correct or what others have said are correct. But we can't be a nation that is lawless. We cannot be a nation that simply ignores our obligations to ourselves, our obligations to our Constitution, our obligations to our own moral standing in the world. And so be tough. If on occasion you have to do something, be prepared to answer for what you're doing. But as the president has said, and before him, President Bush was also in this vote, we do not torture people.
But the ends justify the means? If you get bin Laden in the end?
We do not torture people. It is against American policy.
I want to end with this.
You can always debate what torture is.
Yeah.
I know what torture is.
A final political matter that is very important at this particular point as the president thinks about it. After the Connecticut massacre, what's the solution? What kind of restrictions should be put in place?
It's a very complex issue, and I'm anxious to see what Vice President Biden is going to come up with, because, you have deranged people throughout the country, unfortunately, and they're part of the problem. You have to be deranged to pick up a Bushmaster or some weapon and go into a school and kill people. So how do we deal with that part of the problem? Is there an issue with violence on television, violence in our games? That has to be looked at. With respect to guns themselves, I'm a gun owner. I'm a believer in the Second Amendment. I know the amendment rather thoroughly. I know the issue of a well-regulated militia. But at the same time, we also have a responsibility under the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to protect our people. So surely we should be able to find some meeting of the minds on this issue. Why can't we test everybody or have everybody run through a screen to make sure that they're a responsible person before they're allowed to buy a weapon, either in a store or in a private transaction? Why can't we do a better job of registering things? And with respect to assault weapons, I see no need for Bushmasters in the hands of an individual person who might be deranged. If you want to fire a Bushmaster, go out to a range and fire a Bushmaster. But whether or not it's in our overall interest to have these kinds of weapons in the hands of Americans who might not be responsible is a question we have to answer. How much are we really giving up if we said that this kind of weapon should not be readily available to anybody who wants to buy one? And so I think we're at a very important point in our national dialogue in this. The NRA feels very, very strongly. Gun owners feel very, very strongly. And at the same time, the American people are concerned about the kinds of things that are happening in our society. Surely, if we can't get the whole ball of wax, I hope that there'll be a way to find something in this continuum of things we can do that we're able to do to demonstrate to the American people that this problem is being taken seriously.
General Powell, we'll leave it there. As always, thank you very much for your views.
Thank you, David.